The room felt unnaturally quiet as my lawyer finished her last sentence and sat back down, and in that silence, I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. My husband was still smirking, still relaxed, still convinced this was just another round he'd win easily. He leaned toward his lawyer and whispered something that made them both grin. And that smug confidence was exactly what gave me the courage I didn't even know I had until that moment. When the judge asked if there was anything further to add before recess, my lawyer stood again, looked directly at me, and nodded slightly, like she was passing me the microphone. I took a slow breath, stood up, and said, "Yes, Your Honor, there is. I'd like you to check page 4 of the financial disclosure." My husband laughed out loud before the judge even responded, shaking his head as if I'd just told a bad joke, and he said, "Page 4, seriously?" That laugh would come back to haunt him in ways I don't think he ever imagined. The judge didn't smile at first. He adjusted his glasses, flipped through the file, and turned to page 4. The courtroom felt frozen in time. My husband was still leaning back, arms crossed, his leg bouncing slightly now, though he tried to hide it. The judge's eyes moved slowly across the page, then back again, lingering longer this time. He looked up at my husband, then back down, and then something unexpected happened. He chuckled, not a loud laugh, but a quiet, amused sound that cut through the tension like a blade. "Counsel," the judge said, looking at my husband's lawyer, "you might want to explain this to me." That was the exact moment my husband's face changed. The color drained from it so fast it was almost frightening. His confident smile collapsed into confusion, then panic. My husband's lawyer stumbled over his words, saying there must be a misunderstanding, that the documents needed clarification. The judge raised a hand to stop him and asked me to explain, directly, calmly in my own words. My voice shook at first, but as I spoke, something steadied inside me. I explained how I'd discovered accounts I didn't know about, loans taken out in my name without my consent, and signatures that weren't mine. I pointed out dates, amounts, patterns. I didn't accuse him emotionally, I just stated facts. The judge listened intently, nodding occasionally, flipping back and forth between pages. My husband stared at me like he was seeing a stranger, his mouth slightly open, his earlier laughter replaced by silence so thick it felt heavy. When the judge asked my husband if he had an explanation, he tried to laugh again, but it came out wrong, brittle and forced. He said it was all part of managing household finances, that I'd agreed verbally, that I just didn't remember. The judge's expression hardened. He asked if there was any written consent. There wasn't. He asked if my husband could explain why funds were transferred to a private account solely in his name while joint debts increased. My husband looked to his lawyer, who avoided eye contact. The judge sighed, rubbed his temple, and said something I will never forget, Ormantiru. This court does not appreciate being missiled. The room felt like it tilted. What followed was surreal. The judge ordered an immediate review of the financial records and postponed final rulings on asset division. He also requested that copies of the documents be forwarded to the appropriate authorities for further investigation. Hearing those words felt like finally exhaling after holding my breath for years. My husband's lawyer requested a brief recess, and the judge granted it. As everyone stood, my husband turned to me, his voice low and furious, whispering, "You planned this." I looked at him and said quietly, "No, I just stopped protecting you." For the first time, he had nothing to say back. During the recess, I sat alone, hands trembling, staring at the floor. I wasn't celebrating. I wasn't even relieved yet. I felt hollow, like everything I'd buried was rushing to the surface at once. Memories replayed in my mind, all the times he'd told me I was stupid, incapable, dramatic. I thought about how close I'd come to believing him completely. My lawyer sat beside me and squeezed my hand, telling me I did exactly what I needed to do. Across the room, my husband argued in hushed tones with his lawyer, gesturing wildly, his polished composure gone. People were staring now, whispering, and for once, it wasn't me under scrutiny alone. When the hearing resumed, the atmosphere had changed entirely. The judge's tone was firmer, colder. He questioned my husband directly, no longer indulging his theatrics. Every evasive answer only dug the hole deeper. At one point, the judge actually said, "Earlier, you seemed amused by these proceedings. I assure you, there is nothing amusing about potential financial fraud." That sentence alone felt like justice in a form I'd never experienced before. My husband stared down at the table, jaw clenched, refusing to look at me. The court session ended with temporary orders that favored me far more than anything previously discussed. Control of the joint accounts was frozen, and I was granted temporary financial independence. Walking out of that courtroom felt unreal. My legs were weak, my chest tight, but there was a strange lightness too. Outside, my husband caught up to me and exploded. He accused me of ruining his life, of being vindictive, of humiliating him. He said I'd always been spiteful and that this proved it. I listened quietly, then said something I'd never dared say before. "You did this to yourself." He stared at me, stunned, then stormed off. In the weeks that followed, the truth unraveled faster than I expected. Investigations revealed more than even I knew. There were additional accounts, hidden debts, and evidence that he'd been manipulating finances long before our marriage. Friends who had distanced themselves from me began reaching out, apologizing for believing his version of events. Some admitted he'd spoken about me behind my back, painting himself as a martyr married to an unstable woman. Hearing that hurt, but it also validated what I'd felt all along. I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't crazy. I'd been systematically undermined. The divorce proceedings continued, but the power dynamic had shifted completely. My husband was no longer smug or confident. He was defensive, cautious, and visibly stressed. His lawyer changed strategies, suddenly more conciliatory, suggesting settlements that were far more reasonable. Part of me wanted to drag it out, to make him feel the same helplessness I had felt, but another part of me was tired. I wanted peace more than revenge. We eventually reached an agreement that protected me financially and acknowledged the misconduct without forcing me to relive everything in open court. Emotionally, the aftermath was complicated. Winning didn't feel like triumph the way movies make it seem. There were nights I cried from sheer exhaustion, mourning not just the marriage, but the version of myself I'd lost along the way. Therapy helped. So did reconnecting with old friends, rediscovering interests I'd abandoned because he'd mocked them. Slowly, I started to trust my own judgment again. I learned how to manage my finances, something he'd always claimed I couldn't do. Every small success felt like reclaiming territory he'd occupied for too long. The most unexpected part was how that courtroom moment followed me. People who heard the story focused on the judge laughing, on the dramatic reveal. But for me, the real victory was quieter. It was the moment I realized I didn't need his approval, his validation, or his permission to speak. I had facts, I had truth, and that was enough. The laughter wasn't mockery. It was disbelief that someone had been so arrogant as to think they could get away with it. Looking back now, I sometimes wonder how different my life would be if I'd spoken up sooner. But I also know I spoke up when I was ready, when I was strong enough to face the consequences. If you're watching this and you see pieces of yourself in my story, I want you to know this. Being quiet doesn't mean you're weak, and speaking up doesn't mean you're cruel. Sometimes, it just means you're done being erased. So that's my story, from the laughter that cut me to the moment it turned against him. If you think I did the right thing, if you believe standing up for yourself is never wrong, hit like on this video. If you want to hear more real stories like this one, subscribe to the channel. And I really want to know your thoughts, so share them in the comments below. What would you have done in my place? I'll see you all in the next story. I still remember the sound of my husband laughing in that courtroom, like it was the punchline to a joke, only he was in on. Like I was some clueless side character in my own life. And I remember the judge raising an eyebrow while my husband smirked and said, "Your Honor, she's just emotional," as if that one sentence erased years of gaslighting, betrayal, and quiet endurance. That was the moment I realized everything I had swallowed for so long was about to come out, and the only question burning in my mind was this: was I wrong for waiting until that moment to finally speak up? Or would you have done the same thing if the person who promised to love you tried to humiliate you in front of everyone? Tell me honestly, because I'm still replaying it in my head every night. Let me take you back to the beginning, because nothing about this started in a courtroom. It started years earlier, when I met him, when I genuinely believed I had found my partner, my teammate, the person who would stand beside me when life got hard. Back then, he was charming in that effortless way, the kind of man who could walk into a room and make everyone feel like he was listening only to them. He remembered small details about me, like how I took my coffee, or how I always hummed when I was nervous. I mistook attentiveness for kindness, confidence for stability, and I ignored the tiny red flags because they were wrapped in smiles and jokes. We dated for 2 years before getting married, and during that time, he was never cruel outright. If anything, he was subtly dismissive, but I told myself I was overthinking. Whenever I got upset, he'd laugh softly and say things like, "You're too sensitive," or, "You always take things the wrong way." I thought love meant compromise, so I compromised pieces of myself without realizing how much I was losing. When we got married, things changed slowly enough that I didn't notice at first. He started correcting me in front of people, always framed as jokes. If I told a story, he'd interrupt with, "That's not how it happened," and then recount it in a way that made me sound foolish. People would laugh, and I'd force a smile, telling myself it wasn't worth making a scene. At home, he controlled the finances, insisting he was just better with numbers. Whenever I asked questions, he'd sigh dramatically and say I wouldn't understand anyway. I worked full-time too, but my paycheck went into a joint account he monitored. If I bought something for myself, he'd ask why I wasted money, even if it was something small. Over time, I stopped asking and stopped buying things that made me happy. The emotional distance grew wider, and arguments became a one-sided performance where he played the calm, rational one, and I was painted as hysterical. He'd record me on his phone when I cried, saying he needed proof of how crazy I got. Those recordings terrified me. Not because I was doing anything wrong, but because I didn't know what he planned to do with them. I started walking on eggshells, choosing my words carefully, measuring my reactions, shrinking myself so there'd be less for him to criticize. Friends noticed I was quieter, but I brushed it off, saying married life was just busy. The breaking point didn't come with a scream or a slap. It came with betrayal so casual it felt unreal. I found out he'd been having an affair with a coworker, not through a dramatic confession, but through an email notification that popped up on our shared tablet. I wasn't snooping, it just appeared, her name followed by words no spouse should ever read. When I confronted him, he didn't apologize. He laughed, actually laughed, and said, "If you were more fun to be around, maybe I wouldn't have looked elsewhere." That sentence shattered something in me. I remember standing there, heart pounding, waiting for him to say he was joking, waiting for remorse, but it never came. Instead, he blamed me for his choices, just like he always had. I asked for a divorce shortly after that, and suddenly, the man who told me I was nothing without him turned cold and strategic. He hired an aggressive lawyer almost immediately, someone who seemed to thrive on intimidation. I couldn't afford the same level of representation, so I found a modest attorney who listened patiently and told me to gather everything I had. That's when I realized how little control I'd had over my own life. Documents were missing, accounts I didn't recognize existed, and debts I had never agreed to. Every discovery felt like uncovering another layer of manipulation. Throughout the divorce process, my husband treated it like a game he was winning. He'd send me emails dripping with sarcasm, mocking my requests for fair division. In mediation sessions, he'd lean back in his chair, arms crossed, smiling while his lawyer spoke over me. When I tried to explain my side, he'd whisper comments under his breath, loud enough for me to hear but quiet enough to deny. "Here come the tears," he'd say, or, "She loves the drama." Each time, my confidence eroded a little more. By the time we reached court, I was exhausted, emotionally and mentally. I hadn't slept properly in weeks. Walking into that courtroom felt like stepping onto a stage where I was already cast as the villain. My husband looked relaxed, almost entertained. He wore a tailored suit and greeted people warmly, shaking hands, laughing. When he saw me, his smile widened like he was enjoying my discomfort. I sat beside my lawyer, clutching my folder so tightly my fingers hurt. The hearing started with procedural things, but then my husband's lawyer began questioning me. Every question was designed to paint me as irresponsible, unstable, and unreliable. They brought up the recordings he'd taken of me crying, playing short clips that made me sound frantic without any context. My husband watched me, as if I were a reality show he'd already seen, shaking his head in exaggerated disappointment. When it was his turn to speak, he took the stand and delivered a performance I barely recognized. He spoke calmly about how he had tried his best to support me, how my emotional outbursts made marriage difficult, and how he was only asking for what was fair. At one point, he actually laughed and said, "Honestly, Your Honor, she's always been dramatic. I never thought we'd be here over something so small." That laugh echoed in my ears, and I felt something shift inside me. Not anger exactly, but clarity. For months, I'd been playing defense, reacting to his moves, trying to explain myself. In that moment, I realized he believed he had already won. He believed I had nothing. And that's when I thought about the binder in my bag, the one my lawyer had helped me organize, the one I hadn't even fully processed yet. Inside were bank statements, emails, and records I'd gathered quietly, piece by piece, after my attorney advised me to look more closely at our finances. There were things in there I didn't understand at first. Numbers that didn't add up, transactions that didn't make sense, and signatures that looked suspiciously unlike mine. But I didn't say anything then. I sat there, letting him mock me, letting the judge observe both of us. I wanted the court to see exactly who he was when he thought he was untouchable. The hearing ended for the day, and as we were leaving, he leaned close to me and whispered, "You should have just taken the deal. This is embarrassing for you." I didn't respond. For the first time in years, his words didn't land the way he expected them to. That night, I went home and spread every document across my kitchen table. I stayed up until sunrise, highlighting, comparing, and cross-referencing. I noticed patterns, repeated transfers to an account in his name only, withdrawals that coincided with large purchases I never saw. There were also loan documents I had never signed, but my name was on them. My hands shook as I realized what I was looking at. This wasn't just manipulation, it was fraud. I called my lawyer first thing in the morning, my voice trembling as I explained what I'd found. She went quiet for a moment, then told me to bring everything in immediately. Over the next few days, my attorney and I went through everything carefully. She explained what it meant, how serious it was, and how it could change the entire case. I felt a mix of fear and vindication. Part of me wanted to confront him immediately, to throw the evidence in his face, but my lawyer advised patience. "Let him keep underestimating you," she said. "It works in our favor." Those words stuck with me. The next court date came faster than I expected. I walked in feeling different, still nervous, but grounded by the knowledge that I wasn't powerless anymore. My husband greeted me with the same smug smile, even joking with his lawyer about grabbing lunch afterward, as if this was just another errand. When proceedings began, his lawyer continued the same narrative, pushing the idea that I was unreliable and incapable of managing finances. At one point, my husband interrupted to add a comment, and the judge allowed it. He laughed again, saying, "She couldn't even balance a checkbook. I handled everything." A few people in the room chuckled softly, and I felt my cheeks burn, but I stayed quiet. As the session went on, I noticed the judge watching him more closely now, especially when he laughed. It was subtle, but it was there. When my lawyer finally stood up to speak, she asked a few calm questions, nothing dramatic. She referenced documents already submitted, laying groundwork without revealing too much. My husband looked bored, glancing at the clock, clearly confident this was going nowhere. And that's where I'll pause, because this was the exact moment everything was about to change, and I want to know what you would have done if you were sitting where I was, knowing the truth, holding proof that could shatter the story your spouse had been telling everyone. Would you have spoken up immediately, or would you have waited for the perfect moment like I did? Before I tell you what happened next, take a second and really think about it, because what I did next is the reason that Courtroom fell silent, and why the judge's reaction still feels surreal to me.